Western civilization began to blossom 2,500 years ago in the small Greek state of Attica, and in particular its capital city, Athens. However, in the early part of the 5th century BC, Athens nearly disappeared. The Acropolis, one of the most famous historical sites in the world, was in ancient times the political and religious heart of the city. But in 480 BC, the buildings on the Acropolis were burned to the ground. The people of Athens had been overwhelmed by an invading army of approximately 1 million Persians, commanded by their fearsome and illustrious king Xerxes I. Athenians deserted the city, and the Persians occupied it. It seemed that Athens was finished, and yet, over the course of the next 50 years, the city emerged as the cultural capital of the entire Greek world and the cradle of contemporary Western science and philosophy. The Acropolis was rebuilt in grand style. By 430 BC, it boasted some of the finest monuments in the world, most notably the Parthenon, the temple of Athena Parthenos. How did Athens rise like a phoenix from the ashes to become one of the greatest cities of ancient times? And who were the leaders, architects and artists that gave this place its special quality, unique in history? After the Persians finally left Athens, a leader emerged in 460 who would guide the city to cultural and military preeminence in the Greek world. He was Pericles, and he's credited not only with bringing about major political reform toward democracy, but also in rebuilding the army and creating some of the most beautiful monuments of all time. Under Pericles' 30 years in office, the Acropolis complex destroyed by the Persians was completely rebuilt. Its principal edifice was the Parthenon, but there were also dozens of smaller temples, each a masterpiece of design and execution. Pericles led the city into its golden age and made the name of Athens immortal. This was an era of great artists like the sculptor Phidias. It was also a time when philosophers like Socrates and Plato contemplated fundamental truths in their schools. In the theatre, Sophocles and Euripides laid the foundations of tragic and comic drama. Almost every aspect of modern Western civilization, even sport, began in 5th century Athens. Pericles died of a lingering fever in 429 after an outbreak of plague the previous year which killed 1/4 of the Athenian population. However, his accomplishments lived on. Athens was the pinnacle of a dynamic society which had been developing for thousands of years. Greece is a land of spectacular landscapes. The ancient Greeks believed the woods and the waters were populated by gods and goddesses and other supernatural creatures. The earliest Greeks were warrior tribes who shared a common language but fought incessantly with each other, struggling for possession of the richest and most fertile land. The first settlements were primitive rural communities. Then, between 1500 and 1200 BC, there was a population explosion, resulting in rapid advances in culture and technology. Palaces and temples sprang up, evidence of which we can still see today. They were an appropriate setting for mythical stories, like those of the poet Homer, and the tales of adventure like the voyage of the Argonauts and the trials of Heracles. Many of these stories are more fiction than fact, but one is thought to be true: Homer's epic tale, the Iliad, which told of the war of the Greeks against the Trojans. Troy was the city that fell to a wooden horse filled with Greek warriors. But did Troy exist? Until modern times, the city and the war were believed to be merely legends. But in 1870, Heinrich Schliemann, an amateur German archaeologist, began to uncover the ruins of Troy. The city had indeed been destroyed by a great coalition formed by the major city-states of continental Greece. It was a rare coalition. They were usually at war with each other. By the beginning of the 5th century BC, there were about 4.5 million people in Greece. It was at this time that Athens emerged as the most powerful of the city-states. Athens still lives and thrives today. The modern city surrounds the Acropolis and incorporates various remains of ancient times, demonstrating thousands of years of continuous human habitation. Teeming with a population of about 5 million people, it's often chaotic and polluted. Nevertheless, it's a vibrant, living link to a vanished world. In many places, the different historical periods the city has lived through are stacked higgledy-piggledy one upon another. But always, soaring majestically above the bustling metropolis, has been the eternal Parthenon and the other sublime temples of the Acropolis. The word Acropolis means citadel, or the high part of a city, and most towns in ancient Greece had one. Indeed, almost every city began as a settlement on top of a hill. Such rocky outcrops formed natural fortresses, protection against marauding wild animals and enemy armies. As Athens grew and spread, it was on the Acropolis that the upper echelons of society lived and worked. It was where philosophers debated and government was conducted. Most importantly, it was where the deities were worshipped. In the Mycenaean period, about 1200 BC, the original walls and huts were replaced by fortifications, which later legends asserted were built by mythical giants. In 450 BC, the Acropolis took on the architectural appearance that established it as the center of Greek culture. Its magnificence remained intact even after the decline of Athens following eventual defeat by Sparta. Later, in the 2nd century AD, the Romans added new walls and buildings like the spectacular amphitheatre of Herodes Atticus at the western edge of the southern slope of the Acropolis. During Pericles' lifetime, Athens was at the height of its splendor. Great political and cultural events unfolded. Its citizens led a comfortable, enjoyable daily life. Families thrived and people lived and worked together in a period of relative prosperity and peace. The 5th century Athenians, like all their fellow Greeks, were devout people. They believed in the absolute power of the gods to help them or harm them. Religious festivals were held throughout the year. The head of the family would make regular sacrifices to the gods. There were also special offerings made on particular occasions, for example, when a member of the family fell ill or was about to embark on a hazardous journey. The regular festivals came to a glorious climax every 4 years in the great procession to the Acropolis. This was the Panathenaea to honor the city's goddess protector, Athena. All Athenians, regardless of status or occupation, were eligible to take part in the joyous procession. In the course of the ceremony, 2 young virgins offered the goddess a peplum, a gown trimmed with sumptuous embroidery. The procession entered the Acropolis through the Propylaea, the monumental western entrance designed by the architect Mnesicles. In those days, there was a gallery with exquisite paintings on canvas by Polygnotus, and later a nude Venus by the portrait painter Apelles. All these masterpieces have vanished without trace. After passing through the Propylaea, worshippers entered the inner courtyard. Here stood Athena as warrior Athena Promachus, 8 meters tall, with her gold spear and helmet. It was one of the earliest statues of Athena. On the right, behind a wall of the temple sacred to Artemis, one could catch a glimpse of the Parthenon, a perspective which survives today. In the time of Pericles, this building contained an intriguing statue, Athena Apteros. Apteros means wingless. It was said her wings had been removed so that the goddess couldn't leave her city. It was the work of the architect Callicrates, a masterpiece in marble, created during a truce between one of the many battles of Athens with its long-standing rival Sparta. Women of this time, between 421 and 406 BC, may not have been allowed to enter this building, the Erechtheum, the most hallowed temple on the Acropolis. It housed the city's holiest relics, including the olive tree which Athena summoned from the earth in her contest with Poseidon. Here also were believed to be the tombs of Erechtheus and Kekrops, legendary founders of the city. And finally, the Palladium was housed here. It was the oldest and most venerated image of Athena, a wooden statuette that simply appeared magically one day from nowhere. The temple's most celebrated remaining feature is the southern portico, supported by 6 caryatids. These exquisite statues of maidens, now ravaged by time, may well have been representations of real women admired for their beauty who lived and died here over 2,000 years ago. From microscopic fragments of paint, archaeologists have managed to recreate something of their original vitality. Of all the structures on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena Parthenos, or Virgin, the invincible goddess of war, remains the most awe-inspiring. 30 meters wide and 70 meters long, it has 8 Doric columns on the facades and 17 on each side. Construction began in 447 BC, and historians believe it was finished about 438. The pristine Pentelic marble from quarries nearby appears to change colour according to the light that shines on it. The Parthenon survived largely intact until 1687 AD, when a Turkish army used it to store ammunition, which exploded, causing massive damage. Though subsequent accidents and pillage have taken their toll, the majesty of the temple survives to this day. Computer reconstruction allows us to imagine these treasures as they were when first created. Here, the eastern pediment shows scenes of the battle for control of Athens between the goddess Athena and Poseidon, god of the sea, which, according to legend, was fought on the site of the Erechtheum. Wonderful as the exterior of the Parthenon was, its real significance lay inside. The temple celebrated one of Athena's most revered personifications, Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin. The statue of Athena inside the temple was, by all accounts, one of the most magnificent of the ancient world. Made of ivory and clothed with gold, it stood over 12 meters tall. It was so expensive, the cost to build it was enough to commission 300 warships. Its sculptor, Phidias, was said to have been inspired by the actual presence of the goddess in his studio as he worked. But the expense angered the Athenians. A charge of impiety was brought against Phidias, and he left the city. The statue remained in place until 426 AD. Then an invading army took it to Constantinople, where it was destroyed in a fire which also consumed most of the city. Archaeologists know about it through the so-called statuette of Varvakion, a small reproduction from the Hellenistic period. For many centuries, the Acropolis of Athens was a beacon for travelers throughout the ancient world. Many were on their way to Delphi, a holy site northwest of Athens. There was a great temple here, dedicated to the god Apollo. Delphi was also the home of the oracle of Apollo, who gave petitioners a cryptic glimpse of the future. Today, experts experiment with techniques duplicating those available to the original builders of Delphi, trying to determine just how the marble was brought here and put into place. This temple was built by the people of Athens in thanks for their great victory against the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Once these rooms were heaped with shields and spears wrested from the Persians and devotional statues made of gold and silver. All these treasures have disappeared. Greek women of the time would have visited Delphi adorned with jewellery and other ornaments. They would have worn cosmetics and perfumes made from herbal extracts like mint, sesame and cumin. A normal day for an ordinary family began at dawn. Breakfast for both adults and children was usually a little bread dipped in wine. During the day, the wife attended to the children and the house, while the husband led a more public life in politics or commerce. Athens offered an almost infinite variety of diversions for a male citizen of the upper classes. If he didn't have to work, he could visit and enjoy drinks with friends while his wife stayed at home. The men did the shopping in an area called the Agora. A huge variety of goods was on offer: household utensils, vegetables, wine, toiletries, pottery, leather, and wooden objects, healing herbs, potions and medicines. Inevitably, coins were dropped, rolled away, lost, and then found years later. They've shown that goods were paid for with both local currency and the coins of other city-states. Undoubtedly, the bargaining was vigorous. Another of the living links between ancient and modern Athens is the market in the city's Monastiraki district. Then, as now, it was a huge, bustling bazaar where you could buy just about anything. 200 years before Christ, a writer reported, in Athens they sell everything in one place. All sorts of figs, bunches of grapes, turnips, pears, apples, fish from every sea, lamb, animal entrails, myrtle berries, water clocks, chickpeas, cow colostrum pudding, and honeycombs. Even families on moderate incomes would have fish and beans as well as onions, cheeses, and garlic on the table at mealtimes. The wine of 5th century Greece had a high alcohol content, so it was served diluted, 1 part wine to 5 parts water. The mixing was done in large bowls, and flavourings such as thyme, mint and cinnamon were sometimes added. Outside the home, drinking provided a crucial social bond, particularly at the symposium. The word symposium literally means to drink together. Wives were not permitted to attend the symposium, but there were women in attendance. They were courtesans, beautiful, educated young women whose skills included dancing, music, and the reciting of comic and erotic poetry. Prostitution was so important in Athens, the great lawgiver Solon included provision for it in his legislation. The trade was concentrated in Keramaikos, the area by the Dipylon Gate, one of the most important access points to the city. The district was also famous for the thousands of craftsmen who produced beautiful pottery decorated with characteristic black and red figures. This fine pottery was traded throughout the ancient world. Pottery production was a key component of the economic life of Athens. Potteries and kilns worked round the clock. A thriving ceramics industry signalled a prosperous society. In large measure, the life of the city depended on what went on inside the Dipylon Gate. In another part of the city, the Agora with its stoa was a major centre of local trade. Built in the 2nd century BC, it became another living link to the past when it was fully rebuilt in 1953. Today, it's the prestigious home of the Agora Museum. The stoa, originally a building with great colonnades, not only housed a 2-story shopping centre, but was also the place where many of the great philosophers of Athens gave their lectures. There were only male philosophers, and only men were allowed to attend the lectures. Women were believed to be incapable of rational thought, and we know very little about their lives. The only words women themselves could leave us were written on their gravestones. At the centre of the Agora stood the Tholos Prytania, erected during the 5th century BC. This is where the Senate assembled to debate the issues of the day, pass laws, decide which rival states to make alliances with, and which to attack. It was here the Senate considered whether Socrates should be put to death for preaching sedition. The senators were able to continue their sessions far into the night because beds were brought in for them. The Thesion dominated the entire area. It was built during the time of Pericles and remains in remarkably good condition. In part, this is because of its conversion in the 5th century AD to a Christian church dedicated to St. George. It has 6 columns on the facade and 13 on each side. The building's conversion to Christianity did not produce a ban on tableaus celebrating pagan heroes like Theseus and Hercules. There used to be a sacred area dedicated to the most powerful Greek gods where this underpass is now. The site was considered the geographical centre of Athens. All distances were measured from an altar that stood here, just as in London the city is centred on Charing Cross. Workers constructing the underpass found some fragments which, together with contemporary accounts, have allowed archaeologists to envisage the site as it was then. The altar was surrounded by a low square wall. Drinking fountains were situated at the 2 entrances for visitors to quench their thirst. The small altar was in the centre. Further on is the stoa of Zeus Eleftherios, another place where Socrates and Plato developed the ideas which would determine the course of all Western philosophy. Today, the city authorities are assessing the feasibility of a project to restore the site. In a sense, vast reaches of time are condensed in a place like Athens, the bustling present and the distant past coexisting as one. Athens, which survived the Persians and the plague and all the assaults that followed. Athens, the stage for endless human drama, thousands of years connected by the same concerns of countless anonymous human beings. Mothers sending their children out into the uncertainties of an ever-changing world. Athens, the city of the greatest philosophers and artists, extraordinary people. Athens, favoured by the gods and cherished by time.